little bit. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan to talk through the CFNA proposal. It begins on page 5 in your pre-conference journal and goes for many, many pages. But Dan's going to, I heard him do this yesterday, and you are so fortunate to have him here to explain it instead of me explain it. He did an expert job. So, Dan, thank you for doing this. Appreciate it very much.
Good afternoon. If you have not known me, have not been to annual conference, I'm Dan Boyd. I'm a senior pastor at First United Methodist Church Carlsbad. A little bit of background. I'm now in my 6th year in the New Mexico Annual Conference. I came from the Northwest Texas Annual Conference. While I was there, I served on that conference's Board of Pension and Health Benefits. And then I served for now 6 years on our CFNA, 3 of which I've been the chair. So my service in the conferences has been in and around the whole issue of finances, because Board of Pension and Health Benefits is a big part of that. And so I'm not going to go through the report, as Jeff said, page by page. Let me give you a little bit of background to get where we are today. Obviously, as when I came on CFNA, I learned, as others on the CFNA always learned, that a couple things. Before I do that, let me just ask you a couple of questions. How many of you have been getting and reading the Tithing Times email letters? Half and half. Okay? Before I leave, I need to get your name. Okay? So thank you for receiving those and reading those. I hope they've been helpful. They've probably spurred some questions, and I'll take those in a little bit. Couple of the other dynamics, kind of background. Historically, as an annual conference, we've passed a budget somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.7 to 3.9. Maybe prior to my coming, it might have been in the $4 million range. I don't know. I can't remember those details off the top of my head. And at the same time we would pass those budget annual conference, everybody on CFNA and pretty much people that were pastors, and we'd come back the next year and realize is that we would pass a $3.7, $3.8 million budget, and we would how much would we ever spend that money? Would we ever even receive that kind of money? No. And so 2 years ago, we in CFNA, and then the other thing we noticed was the payout of our budget, and particularly general and jurisdictional conference funds, was on a slope going down. Okay. And we also noticed that though a couple of dynamics, roughly about 85% of the churches were able to pay and remit 100% of their shared ministries askings. But we had several churches, and some of them were several larger churches, but not always larger churches, that were seemingly in a chronic concern of not paying very much of their apportionments. But overall, as an annual conference, particularly when you looked at general conference and jurisdictional conference funding, we were blessed to get 70% paid, and we were on a downward slope. In last 2014, we barely paid just over 60% of our general and jurisdictional apportionment. So that those dynamics began to spur conversation a couple years ago, and working through with the CFNA. What are some of the issues? What are some value issues? What are some equity issues? And we began to do some study. And we did one thing. We looked at this. No matter what the economy is, no matter what the budget at annual conferences pass, when we count the dollars being sent in by the churches of the annual conference as an aggregate, how much money are we receiving? And we did a more than a 10-year study, and the 10-year plus average is $3 million. Sometimes it was a little bit above that, sometimes a little bit below that, but on an average it was $3 million. It didn't matter whether the economy was great, it didn't matter if the economy was tough, it didn't matter whether we were buying into the latest flavor of the month program from annual conference or general conference. Roughly, the churches in the New Mexico Annual Conference, which you guys make up, and I make up, were sending in about $3 million. And yet we were passing $3.7, $3.8, $3.9 million budgets. Right. We can't continue to do that. And is there some ways we can begin to refocus our relationship together financially as Methodist Christians to re-engage some trust and look at some equity issues. And part of that equity issue is this. We did a study and asked, okay, two things. One is, let's sort of begin to think of ourselves not as expense-based organizations, but income-based organizations, like a business would look. Because churches, we have a tendency to think, okay, we've got the general conference, we've got the jurisdictional apportionments, we've got the conference apportionments, then we know what the council on finance, the council on ministries in the old model, or the council said we need to spend. We put all that together, and so when we look at what our expenses may be for the year, it's X number of dollars. Well, businesses don't start with expenses. Businesses start with what? What's our income going to be? What do we want to create as income? So we decided, let's think of ourselves first income and then secondary expense. So we asked this question. The asking that we were asking churches for shared ministries, what percent of their income is that? What percent of their income is that? And we discovered we were all over the board. There were some churches that were only being asked about 6% of their income for shared ministries. And there were some churches that were being asked 22 and 23% of their income for shared ministries. And so we began to have conversation that is not a very equitable situation. That's not a shared burden, because the church that's paying 23% of their income is, in a sense, carrying more of a burden than the churches that's paying only 6% or 7%. So we then were introduced to a consultant named Paul Durdak, who is a retired clergy from the Cal Nevada Conference, and he served churches of a whole variety of sizes and situations when he was an active pastor. But he's also, at one time, was the chief operating officer for UMCOR, and he's served the general church and the area of finances in many different ways. His latest work was when the church, when I say the church, we as a church, as an international church, decided to address the issue that the pastors in the central conferences in the world didn't have a pension program. We in America, we've got a great pension program. They didn't have a pension program. And we thought that wasn't an equitable, fair situation as a denomination when they said, who is the person that can help us create a plan that will work in the central conferences to create a pension plan for the denomination for those pastors. They picked Paul Durdak, and he has done a fabulous job. So he loves the church. He understands finances. He understands stewardship. He understands business. He understands best practices. He understands what is equitable and how to deal with money. So he's been working with us for about little over 2 years now. So what we discovered is there are multiple number of annual conferences around, particularly in the United States, that have gone to a different model in terms of shared ministries. And in 2012, the General Church changed the Book of Discipline to allow, instead of the annual conference handing every local church a bill that says, here's your $20,000 bill, this is what you owe for apportionments, and here's your line items, here's how it all works out. The annual conferences, if they choose, can say this to a local church. We believe the most ethical way to do this is to ask for a percentage of your income. And so we began to look at that model. And we began to ask our question, okay, what do we already have as people about equity and income and shared responsibility? And obviously that lighted upon us the idea of the tithe. Now, biblically, that's for an individual person or an individual family to tithe, but we share that as a principle of equity in terms of finances. And so we said, what if we became a tithing annual conference, in that we would ask the local church for a tithe of their income? And then we noticed a little bit of a hiccup in the way we did our budgeting and our financial responsibilities. Currently, about $600,000 of the annual conference shared ministry budget went directly to pay for the health benefits and pension of retired clergy and those clergy who are on disability. Not every annual conference does it that way. a lot of annual conferences do it just like we do it for active clergy. If you have an active clergy in your church who's on the pension program, your financial treasurer or secretary gets a bill every month for their cost of the pension and health benefits. And it's a direct bill. You pay that person's share of that cost, or that person's cost. So we began to ask the idea, what if we took the $600,000, which we've been sharing through shared ministries, and ask ourselves, when we look at the dollar amounts that's costing each local church, what percentage of their income is that? When we apportioned out the $600,000 to Carlsbad, to First Roswell, to St. Mark's, when they pay that amount on their apportionments or shared ministries line, what percentage of their income is that? And we did that for 10 years. And this is what we discovered. For every local church in the annual conference, it was never lower than 1.7% and never higher than 2.3%. So what's the average of 1.7 and 2.3? It's 2%. And so we said, okay, we're already asking to cover that cost, 2% of the church's income. If we ask for a tithe, a 10%, on top of that, to cover the rest of the shared ministries, we're actually asking for 12%, which is more than the tithe. And we decided at CFNA, we're going to be bullheaded enough, Eastern and Central and Northern New Mexicans and Texans, to go, we can do this on 10%. So what we came to, the conclusion was this: we are going to ask local churches, and this is what the proposal does, 8% of your line 62 operational income for the shared ministries, and we are going to direct bill the retiree portion right alongside us, just a line below the bill you get for your active clergy, and it will roughly be 2%. So in general, that's the basic change. No longer will the annual conference give your local church a bill, line item bill, of 25 different apportionments saying this is your dollar amount to pay for that. What we were saying is this: you work as pastor and finance person and chair of finance committee, and when you look at the definition as defined in the proposal, what your income is, you report that to our conference treasurer on a monthly basis, and you remit as your offering to pay for our shared ministry together, 8% of that to the annual conference, and then you pay your direct bill for the retiree portion of health benefits and pension. And the other part of the proposal is this: we decided that we were going to do away with the history of passing a $3.9 billion I wish we had $3.9 billion. $3.9 million budget, knowing we were only going to get $3 million in. We just didn't think that had an integrity. And so what we've committed to do is say this: the initial proposal was the budget that we would propose the income asked would never be more than 10% of the previous 2 years previous total annual conference line 62 income. In other words, we were going to live within the income that we'd had a 10-year history of getting. And if we decided as an annual conference we had ministry to do, and ministry that needed new resources and new focusing, we were going to have a deeper conversation with the Council on Finance and Administration at the annual conference to say, well, we need to spend it here, but that means we don't need to spend it over here, rather than just adding it on as an additional thing that we just want funded. To stay really tight to that history of where we are, and to have honest conversations about what really are the priorities of the annual conference and how to spend the money. So in order to do that, in order to pass a balanced budget, given the income that we expected, because what we also realized is this: we're not starting off with the assumption that every church is going to pay 100% of that 8%. There are going to be some churches struggling to do just like they've been struggling. So we realized we're going to have to kind of back off that income, and you can see that in the proposal where we backed off of that. And my brain just left. I'm sorry. In order to be able to then have a balanced spending plan or budget, we were going to be honest about something. We were only going to pay 70% of our general church portion. Now that's a step up because in 2014 we only paid 61% of them. But we were going to challenge ourselves as an annual conference through the CFNA. Our commitment is to pay 70% of it, 70% of the apportionment. So that's the proposal that is before you in that pre-conference plan. Since then, we've had a couple of pastors ask a very legitimate question. Can we actually do that as an annual conference? Say, we're not going to pay 100% of our apportionment. And the answer from the General Conference and from the Judicial Council is no, you cannot do that. So there will be a slight change that will be sent out to you in the next couple of weeks. Basically, the discipline says that an annual conference has to receive and we use the word shared ministries, the discipline says apportioned amount, from the general church, and it has to be apportioned to the local churches without reduction. In other words, 100%. So even though we've only been paying 60 to 65 to 64, and that's been a long, long history, we can't be honest about that and just go, that's what we're going to do, and we're going to have a plan that helps us get back to 100. You have to apportion 100%. So we're going to add another column to the proposal that shows a budget that shows that we will pay 100%. But we did the math. If every church in the annual conference remits the full 8% of your income and pays the rough 2% to the cost for retirees, health benefit, and pension, we will have enough income, given the budget we propose, to pay 100% of our general and jurisdictional costs. Now, can you imagine that's going to happen? The annual conference, we get to report to each other that we paid 100%. Now, we're not there yet, but we believe we can get there. But so we're going to do two things. What is currently showing as the budget in your pre-conference packet is going to be renamed to the spending plan. And then we're going to have a budget that shows paying 100% with an asterisk that says if everybody pays their full 8%, we'll be able to do this. And then we're going to wink at each other and go, we know we're not going to get there this year. And if you want to know what's going to guide your treasurer and the CFNA about where the money is going to be spent, it's by that spending plan. Okay? And I and Kathy and Paul Durdak got the discipline out. We got the seven associated judicial council rulings related to those kind of dynamics out, and we went line by line by them and put our plan up against. Really, the plan that first initiated it was the Indiana Annual Conference back in 2009. They joined two annual conferences as to one to make one Indiana Annual Conference, and they did exactly what we initially planned. Here's our budget. We can only pay 65% of our apportionments because they had only been paying 50% of theirs, but they were going to try to challenge each other and pay 65. They passed that budget. It got challenged on the floor of their annual conference. The bishop ruled it in order. Someone challenged the bishop's order and went directly to judicial council, and judicial council said, no, the bishop's wrong. You can't do that. And the way they responded was doing exactly what they did. They simply passed a budget with showing paying 100% of apportionments with an asterisk that said if everybody pays their full percentage, we'll be able to do that. They've gone from paying back in 2009 50%. They're up just a little bit over 85% now. So that's their history of increase.